Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
I am Jeff Kellick, and thank you, and welcome back to the Consequential Actions podcast. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. This is not one in a series of episodes of long-form podcast. This is a little break between the Christmas holiday and the new year. So as we celebrate Christmas and as we enter the new year, I want to share some book recommendations, some essential reading for anyone who has enjoyed our explorations of liberty, economics, and the proper limits of government throughout this year in 2025. These texts, to me, represent the intellectual foundation from which much of our analysis rests. Some of these texts I'm about to talk about are classics that have been illuminating minds for over a century. Others are more contemporary. They're works that apply timeless principles to our current movement. What unites them is their commitment to asking the question we return to again and again on this show. How much power should government wield? And what happens when it exceeds its proper bounds? So let's begin. I'm going to start with a couple of gateway texts. I want to begin specifically with two books that I consider the perfect entry points into classical liberalism and libertarian thought. These are books that I actually gift regularly because they accomplish something remarkable. They distill profound economic and political wisdom into short, accessible works that can be read in an afternoon, yet can be contemplated for a lifetime. And I'm going to begin with Frederick Bastiat, The Law, published in 1950. Just months before his death. At roughly 75 pages, it is a marvel of compression. Bastiat's central insight concerns what he calls legal plunder, the perversion of law from its proper function of protecting life, liberty, and property into an instrument for taking from some and giving to others. Listen to how he frames the fundamental question. To quote Bastiat directly, life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. And this is a profound inversion of how most people think about rights and government. Rights are not granted by the state. They precede the state. The state's only legitimate function is to protect what already exists. Bastiat then offers his famous test for identifying when law has been perverted. Again, to quote Bastiat, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. If an individual cannot morally do something, take his neighbor's property, for instance, then a group of individuals acting through government cannot morally do it either. The fact that a collective action does not transmute that theft into justice. Think about that in relation to taxes. Think about that in relation to any time that government takes from an individual on behalf, and maybe even, as some would say, altruistically for the benefit of those less fortunate. But again, could those persons, without the coercion of government, could they morally take from somebody to give somebody else? Here's where Bastiat becomes prophetic about the growth of government. Again, to quote Bastiat in this short text, he covers so much. Now, legal plunder can be committed in an infinite number of ways. Thus, we have an infinite number of plans for organizing it. Tariffs, protection, benefits, subsidies, encouragements, progressive taxation, public schools, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed profits, minimum wage, a right to relief, a right to the tools of labor, free credit, and so on and so on. Again, written in 1850, and yet every item on that list remains contested today. Bastiat understood that once the principle of using law to redistribute property is accepted, there is no logical stopping point. Everyone will seek to plunder everyone else. The moral consequences are equally severe. Again, to quote Bastiat, when law and morality contradict each other, the citizen has the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or losing his respect for the law. That single sentence explains so much of the cynicism we see toward government today. When people witness laws that violate basic moral principles, when they see the politically connected receive what honest citizens are forbidden to take, they lose their faith in either morality itself or in the legitimacy of legal authority. The law remains one of the clearest expositions ever written of why limited government is not merely a policy preference, but a moral imperative. My second gateway text is from Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. Published in 1946, Hazlitt expressly acknowledges his debt to Bastiat's earlier essay, What is Seen and What is Not Seen. And this book can be understood as a modernization and expansion of Bastiat's economic insights. The one lesson, as stated clearly at the outset, to quote Hazlitt, the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. That sounds simple and almost obvious, yet Hazlitt demonstrates through 24 chapters that virtually every popular economic fallacy stems from violating this principle, from looking only at the immediate and visible effects while ignoring the secondary and hidden consequences. F.A. Hayek himself praised the book, noting there is no other modern book from which the intelligent layman can learn so much about the basic truths of economics in so short a time. I mean, look at this is a book you can comfortably read in an afternoon. And this is why I love it so much. Hazlitt's famous illustration is the broken window fallacy. Again, borrowed from Bastiat. A vandal breaks into a shopkeeper's window. Onlookers console the shopkeeper by noting that at least the glazier, the glassmaker who's going to repair the window, at least the glazier will get business. The glazier will spend that money elsewhere, and so the economy benefits. But this reasoning ignores what is unseen. The shopkeeper would have spent that money on something else. Perhaps a new suit from the tailor, Bastiat and Hazlitt give the example. The glazier's gain is the tailor's loss. No new wealth was created. It was merely redirected, and society is poor one window. It's a very clear and distinct rebuttal of Keynesianism. And we'll talk a lot on our channel about the fallacies, the economic fallacies of John Maynard Keynes, and the belief that some have that underlie that wars, natural disasters, or government spending on programs can create prosperity. We see the jobs created by government projects. What we don't see are the jobs that would have existed if those resources had remained in private hands. The loss of the tailor, the loss of the persons who would have benefited from actual economic growth. And the other thing that we know happens in those destructive acts is we lose net assets. In the case of the broken window, of course, we lose that window. Together, Bastiat and Hazlitt provide the moral and economic framework for understanding why government intervention so often produces the opposite of its intended effects. If you read no other book on political economy, on economics, on policy, on philosophy, read these two. I guarantee after you read them, you will want to go much, much deeper. And so let's talk a little deeper. For those who do want to go deeper, I recommend several works from the Austrian School of Economics, the tradition that has most thoroughly explored the relationship between the individual liberty and economic prosperity. And I'm going to start with none other than Ludwig von Mises. And I'm going to start with his Human Action. Now, where these two books were very light, read in an afternoon, this one may take a little longer. It's a monumental work, over 900 pages, and it's dense. It's not light reading. It is dense. Read over and over to fully understand and grasp where he's coming from. Originally written in German, translated so that we can properly understand it and digest it, although by Mises himself. Although Mises wrote this as his seminal work. We're going to talk about a couple of his other works as well. It represents the most comprehensive treatment of economics ever written from the perspective of individual human choice. Mises opens with what may be the most fundamental statement in all of economics. To quote Mises, human action is purposeful behavior. This deceptively simple sentence contains the entire Austrian methodology. Economics is not primarily about aggregates, mathematical models, or statistical correlations. It's about understanding how individuals make choices under the conditions of scarcity. Every economic phenomenon, prices, wages, interest rates, business cycles, ultimately traces back to the individual human beings pursuing their goals within limited means. From this foundation, Mises builds an entire system of economic reasoning. Again, to quote Mises, "The body of economic knowledge is an essential element in the structure of human civilization. It is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built." Mises understood that economic ignorance is not merely an academic deficiency, but an existential threat to civilization itself. When people do not understand how markets coordinate human activity, then they become susceptible to political programs that promise prosperity through planning, but only deliver poverty and tyranny. And we see that today, over and over and over again. On the question of value, Mises is equally clear. Again, to quote, "Since nobody is in a position to substitute his own value judgments for those of the acting individual, it is vain to pass judgment on other people's aims and volitions. No man is qualified to declare what would make another man happier or less discontented." This insight demonstrates the pretensions of central planners who believe they know better than the individuals what those individuals should want. The market is not merely efficient. It is the only mechanism that respects human dignity by allowing each person to pursue their own conception of the, quote, good life. Human action demands serious engagement, but for those willing to undertake the journey, it remains the definitive statement of the case for the free market. And there are a lot of tools and resources out there, by the way. There is One of my favorite, the Human Action Podcast by Dr. Bob Murphy. And there are podcasts that will go through every single chapter of Human Action and discuss it in detail. So if you do go through this journey of reading this book and you want to study more on Mises, I would recommend going to Mises.org and take a look at the Mises Institute, and you can get a lot more there from that. Let's stay on Mises for a minute, and we're going to go to a previous work before Human Action called The Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises. For listeners interested specifically in monetary economics, and given the inflation we've witnessed in recent years, that should be all of us, Mises' earlier work, The Theory of Money and Credit, first published in 1912, remains essential. For those of you who just listened to our latest podcast episode on the Federal Reserve, you'll remember the Federal Reserve was enacted with the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. The meeting at Jekyll Island was in 1910, so this is right around that same time. We certainly wish those financiers and bankers that were present at that meeting in Jekyll Island in 1910 would have had the benefit of reading The Theory of Money and Credit from Ludwig von Mises. Certainly, we'd be going down a much different path if the Federal Reserve Act were not passed in 1913. For this is where Mises developed the Austrian theory of the business cycle, explaining how credit expansion by banks creates artificial booms that inevitably end in busts. And the relevance to our current situation after years of near zero interest rates and quantitative easing should be obvious. Mises warned, and I'll quote from the book, "Imprudent granting of credit is bound to prove just as ruinous to a bank as to any other merchant. The 2008 financial crisis and the instabilities we continue to experience stem directly from the abandonment of the principles Mises articulated over a century ago." Now let's go to one of Mises' students, Friedrich Hayek. And F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944. Perhaps the most famous warning ever written about the dangers of central planning. A Nobel Prize laureate, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek wrote during World War II, when many Western intellectuals believed that the future belonged to socialism, that central planning was not only more efficient than markets, but also more humane, Hayek's great contribution was to show that the choice between planning and markets is not merely an economic question, but a choice between freedom and servitude. His central argument, and to quote, "What our generation has forgotten is that the system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less for those who do not. It is only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently that nobody has complete power over us." What Hayek was saying was that when the state controls the economy, it controls everything. Your job, your housing, your ability to travel all become dependent on political favor. There is no private sphere into which the individual can retreat. Hayek also anticipated how planning would erode democratic institutions. To quote, "The more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual." And on moral dimension, freedom to order our own conduct in the sphere where material circumstances force a choice upon us, and responsibility for the arrangement of our own life according to our own conscience, is the air in which alone moral sense grows, and in which moral values are daily recreated in the free decision of the individual. Liberty is not merely a means to material prosperity. It is the precondition for moral agency itself. A society that removes the necessity of individual choice also removes the possibility of individual virtue. Hayek's warning has proven prophetic again and again, as he noted. Again, to quote, although we have been warned by some of our greatest political thinkers of the 19th century, by Tocqueville and Lord Acton, that socialism means slavery, we have steadily moved in the direction of socialism. The Road to Serfdom remains essential reading for anyone who wishes to understand why the growth of government power threatens not merely our prosperity, but our humanity. I want to talk a little bit about understanding political conflict as well. And for that, I'm going to turn to Thomas Sowell. For those listeners who have followed our Parties, Ideologies, and Systems series on the Substack at consequentialactions.com, Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions provides the perfect theoretical complement. Written in 1987, Sowell's great insight is that most political disagreements are not primarily about facts or policies, but about fundamentally different assumptions regarding human nature. He identifies two basic visions, the constrained and the unconstrained. To quote Sowell, the constrained vision is a tragic vision of the human condition. The unconstrained vision is a moral vision of human intentions, which are viewed as ultimately decisive. The unconstrained vision promotes pursuit of the highest ideals and the best solutions. By contrast, the constrained vision sees the best as the enemy of the good, a vain attempt to reach the unattainable being seen as not only futile, but often counterproductive. Those with constrained vision, think Adam Smith, the American founders, Edmund Burke, believe that human nature is fundamentally unchanging and that man is inherently self-interested. Given these constraints, the best we can hope for is not perfection, but workable trade-offs. Institutions matter more than intentions because institutions channel inevitable self-interest toward beneficial ends. Those with unconstrained vision, think Rousseau, Godwin, many modern progressives, believe that human beings are perfectible and that social problems stem from flawed institutions rather than flawed human nature. Given the right education, the right policies, the right leaders, human beings can be transformed. This explains why people who agree on none of the specific issues somehow always end up on the same side. But to quote Sowell again, while believers in the unconstrained vision seek the special causes of war, poverty, and crime, believers in the constrained vision seek the special causes of peace, wealth, or a law-abiding society. One vision asks, why is there evil? The other asks, why is there good? The questions themselves reveal incompatible assumptions about what constitutes the natural baseline of human social life. Sowell's framework illuminates why political debates so often talk past each other. We're not merely disagreeing about policies, we're operating from incommensurable visions of human possibility. The book has been praised by thinkers across disciplines. Steven Pinker called Sowell's explanation the best theory given to date for understanding the deep structure of political disagreement. For anyone trying to understand Team Red versus Team Blue persists despite all the evidence that both teams regularly betray their stated principles, a conflict of visions is indispensable. And let's get a little bit more modern. I want to recommend two books by Scott Horton that apply to the principles of non-intervention and to our contemporary geopolitical situation. I'm going to start with Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Published in 2024, it's the most thoroughly documented account available of how American foreign policy decisions, from NATO expansion to the 2014 coup in Kiev, led inexorably to the current conflict. With over 6,600 footnotes and 7,800 citations in this brick of a book, Horton builds his case almost entirely from the words of American diplomats, bureaucrats, and politicians themselves. This is not a work of speculation, but of meticulous historical reconstruction. John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago calls it a manna from heaven for anyone who wants to know where the extreme Russophobia in the West came from, as well as the central role the United States played in causing the Ukraine war. Ron Paul writes, Scott Horton has become an invaluable chronicler of the deconstruction wrought by our interventionist foreign policy. With his new book, Provoked, Scott blows the lid off the mountains of lies used to justify Washington's waste of billions of dollars in countless Ukrainian lives in a futile proxy war with Russia. The book is essential for understanding why the repeated claim that Russia's invasion was unprovoked is itself a form of propaganda designed to obscure decades of American provocation. For those that are looking forward to our next series, as a little preview, we will talk about American foreign policy from the days of our founders, from the warnings of Washington and Jefferson, through the antebellum and Civil War periods, and then through the expansion in 1898 and the turn towards American imperialism. We'll talk about how the decisions made during that time led to further and further dominoes to fall. A different domino theory maybe than one that you would be expecting. And I'll wrap today with one more book from Scott Horton. And this is a little bit older book. It was copyrighted, published in 2021. And so as a companion to Provoked, if you're more interested in the Middle East, I would recommend Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, published in 2021. Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, wrote, if you only read one book this year on America's unending war on terror, it should be this persuasive and devastatingly damning account of how the United States created the original Al-Qaeda terrorism threat by its own actions, and then increased that threat by orders of magnitude by its wanton killings in one country after another in the name of counterterrorism. Horton demonstrates that our foreign policy failures are not accidents, but predictable consequences of ignoring basic principles about the limits of power. Just as Bastiat showed that government intervention in the economy produces unintended consequences, Horton shows that military intervention abroad produces blowback that makes us less safe. From Afghanistan to Iraq, from Libya to Syria, Yemen to Somalia, the pattern is consistent. Intervention creates the very threats it claims to address, justifying still more intervention in an endless cycle. So there you have it. My reading list for 2026. From Bastiat's moral clarity about the proper functions of law through Hazlitt's economic insights about seen and unseen consequences, to Mises and Hayek's comprehensive defenses of the free market, to Sol's illumination of the deeper structure of political disagreement, and finally to Horton's application of non-interventionist principles to our current moment. These books share a common thread. They all ask fundamental questions that animated Madison, Jefferson, and the classic liberals who built the intellectual foundations of the American experience. That question is not, what good could government accomplish, but rather, what limits must be placed on government to prevent tyranny? As we enter a new year, with new political battles ahead, these texts provide the analytical tools necessary to cut through the rhetoric and evaluate politicians based on what they actually do. Did their actions leave Americans more free or more governed? That is the question that matters. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I am Jeff Kellick, reminding you that actions do have consequences. And we'll be back with our next series in January of 2026. Till then, have a great day.